Hello, so in this video I'm going to be talking through OCR A Level Sociology 40 mark essay technique and really going through 9 key aspects of this, so 9 kind of key tips to think about. So the plan for the video is as follows, and we've got Karl Marx here who's going to be our guide, and at the end he's going to actually give us some tips for A-star top level answers. So we're going to talk about the Marx scheme, we're going to talk about overall structure, then go into introductions, main paragraphs, then breaking down the components of the main paragraph, so knowledge and understanding, application, evaluation, then talk about conclusions, and then finally get to the top tips. So hopefully, even if you don't study OCR A-level sociology and you do a different exam board, hopefully some of this will be useful in terms of how to structure your answers. So to begin with, we're going to look at the top level of the Marx scheme and just briefly kind of talk about this. So before we get there, the questions for OCR A-level sociology 40 markers, which is the big question as part of paper 3, are always going to be kind of assess the view or evaluate the view. They're always going to have those kind of question stems. And there's 3 assessment objectives. The first one, which is out of 16 marks, is knowledge and understanding. So I'm going to talk about what that means later on in the video, but that's a big part of this. So 16 out of the 40 marks are for knowledge and understanding. The second assessment objective is for application, and that's really linking the knowledge back to the question. Again, I'll talk about that in more detail and give an example. And then finally, the analysis and evaluation is just this ability to evaluate what you've been discussing. So it could be the weakness, it could be strengths as well, and this idea of a kind of reflective tone, and obviously a conclusion is needed to get to the top level as well. So the overall structure for the 40 markers that I suggest is an introduction with 3 or 4 main paragraphs and then a conclusion. Now, what I've seen students do and what I've seen the exam board do in some of the exemplars that they release is actually they do kind of evaluative paragraphs. So you could have kind of 3 main paragraphs and then kind of 3 evaluative paragraphs after each one of those. So then you might end up with 6 overall paragraphs, if that makes sense. We're going to go through that later. But that would be my suggestion for this. Okay, so on to introductions. So really, the purpose of the introduction is to kind of set out the question, make any kind of key definitions, and also maybe take it slightly further. If it's a question on crime, which the exemplar I'm going to be using is an answer for a crime and deviance question, is it could be useful to think of kind of what that perspective thinks about official statistics, and also kind of hint at your argument potentially. So here is an exemplar intro on the question of assess Marxist explanations of crime and deviance. So this one says, Marxist explanations of crime focus on the way that the criminal justice system serves the interests of the ruling class. Marxists argue that official statistics are socially constructed to criminalize the ruling class and hide crimes of the powerful like corporate crimes. So what we've got there is the kind of overall point that Marxists argue about the criminal justice system, then getting into the official statistics, and then, setting it up to talk about kind of corporate crimes as well. So we can almost see the kind of structure, potentially, of an essay in there. Okay, so going on to main paragraphs. So as I said, I quite like the evaluation within the paragraphs, but I know that the exam board also quite likes evaluation at the end. So my kind of suggestion is on the left here. So you do a point, so the focus of the paragraph, then you just follow a structure of kind of study, explanation, evaluation, study, explanation, evaluation, study, explanation, evaluation, and then a summary overall kind of weighing up this paragraph. So for example, you could have a paragraph on a Marxist question of this idea that the law serves the interests of the ruling class. You could have a paragraph on that with 3 kind of key studies, three pieces of evidence for that you then evaluate and summarize at the end. Or you could do a paragraph where you talk about the key studies and you explain them and you summarize it, and then you have an evaluative paragraph afterwards, evaluating what you've just been talking about. So you're doing exactly the same thing, but you're just doing it kind of separately. So it's entirely up to you. If you've been taught one way and you like that way, that's fine. This is just a suggestion of how you can do it. So now moving on to knowledge and understanding. So knowledge and understanding can come from 4 areas in A-level sociology. It can come from perspectives, so discussing perspectives, so mentioning functionalism, for example. It could come from studies, so a specific name of a sociologist, so like Merton talking about strain theory. It can come from concepts, like the concept of anomie, for example. And it can also come from contemporary examples, like the London riots. So that's the 4 ways that you can build in knowledge and understanding. So there really is lots and lots of ways for you to get those 16 marks. So here's a paragraph from that Marxism essay. This is an exemplar, top level Marxism essay. And the exemplar is this. So as we're reading through it, have a think about where's the evidence? What would you categorize as kind of good evidence here? So it says the third element of Marxist criminology focuses on the way in which law enforcement is biased. Most police time is spent in working class areas. Phillips and Bowling discuss the over-policing of black neighbourhoods, for example, which is a way of controlling a working class and potentially rebellious section of the population. In evaluation, it could be argued that all areas of society are policed. In 2011, many of Great Britain's MPs were arrested for fraudulent expenses claims, suggesting that the police focus on everybody, not just working class people. So hopefully you've got that. It talks about Marxist criminology. It talks about Phillips and Bowling. And it also talks about the expenses scandal of 2011. So really there's kind of 3 points there that you could say are pieces of kind of knowledge and understanding. Okay, now on to application. And sometimes this is the bit that students find most difficult. Application is just linking your evidence back to the question, just making sure that you're linking what you're saying back to the overall question. So here's an exemplar which I think does do that, and I think it's clear that it's got good application. Again, it's on the Marxism question. It says, in the early 20th century, Bonger considered the link between capitalism and crime. Capitalism is based on values such as greed and self-interest, which encourages deviant behaviour. Those at the bottom of the system are deprived and therefore may turn to crime as a result of their desperate circumstances. This was supported many years later by Gordon, who argued that crime is a rational response to the situation many working class people find them in, and the dog-eat-dog nature of capitalist society. This has been criticised, though, as it fails to explain why most of those at the bottom of society still don't commit crime. So you can see the application a couple of times there. The sentence where it says, those at the bottom of society are deprived and therefore may turn to crime. That's application. And also when it says this was supported many years later, it's kind of adding on to that. So it's kind of the explanation, isn't it? Application. It's linking it back to the overall question. Right, we've seen an example of evaluation in that last paragraph we looked at. So evaluation is weighing up the evidence. So it could be positive, discussing the strengths of certain studies, perspectives, concepts. Or it can be negative. So it's discussing the weaknesses, where things fall down, areas that they don't talk about. And you can also bring in new evidence to discuss this. And often I've found that postmodernism is a useful one because it's quite different to everything else. So postmodernism often is a good one. But here's a paragraph that actually uses feminism as a way to evaluate Marxism. So it says, although Marxist approaches do provide us with some reasons as to why crime appears to be a working class problem, the theory can be seen as contradictory, with some Marxists showing why poor people are more likely to commit crime and other Marxists denying this is the case. Feminists are critical of the Marxist perspective, as Heidenson would state it is mainstream and ignores the involvement and treatment of women, both as offenders and victims, by assuming that crime is a response to capitalism and social class. Gender issues get ignored. So can you see how they've used feminism and the feminist explanations to evaluate Marxism? So they talk about feminists, so that'd be one piece of evidence. They've talked about Heidenson, that's the second. They've talked about the concept of mainstream, so that's the third. So they've actually used 3 pieces of evidence, knowledge and understanding there, to evaluate Marxism. So when you're writing your answers, think about all the other knowledge you know. Think about all the other perspectives and concepts you know. How can they challenge what you've been talking about? Okay, so then in conclusion, what you really do is kind of like answer the question, weigh up all the different strands of the argument, and it's useful to think about how useful is this view? How useful is the perspective? So, as I said at the start, the question is always going to be assess the view or evaluate the view. So, thinking your conclusion, how useful is this view? What is it? What is it good for? What is it not so good for? So here's an exemplar. It says, in conclusion, the Marxist perspective does not suggest realistic policies to solve the problems of crime, and it does not fully explain why not all individuals in a capitalist society commit crime. But it does explain why the police focus on working class areas, and the study of white collar crime does go some way in trying to give a fuller picture of crime by exploring how issues of power can relate to the creation and enforcement of crime, which has to be seen as a positive thing. So, can you see how it's basically doing strengths and weaknesses there, isn't it? Just pulling it all together and kind of fully summarizing what's been said in the essay. Okay, so last but not least, we've got Karl Marx here discussing some tips for top level answers, how to get an A, how to get an A star in these answers. So really you need to get to the top level for the first assessment objectives. You need wide-ranging evidence, so links to other perspectives. You know, if you're talking about Marxism, there's a link there to strain theory, isn't it? There's a link that you could make. As I showed in the exemplar paragraph on evaluation, bringing in evidence to evaluate the perspective in the question. So that kind of sentence starter, this is similar to, or this contrasts with, this has been challenged by, this is supported by. So try and make it really wide-ranging, the evidence. Another point is about developed explanation. So make sure that you link back to the question. So if you give an example, for example, you know, if you're talking about corporate crime, and you could just say this exemplifies the Marxist focus on, you know, crimes of the powerful or something like that. Just that sentence starter, this exemplifies, or this shows, you know, this highlights. Those kind of things can really help you with that. You also need developed evaluation. So this can be challenged by, because, and I think the exemplar I showed just a second ago really kind of shows that, highlights that developed evaluation. And the final point, which I think is a really good way to show how you can link your sociological knowledge to the wider world and contemporary examples and contemporary issues, is the use of contemporary examples. And that, again, it counts as knowledge and understanding. And this is something that examiners really, really look highly on. So I've done a separate video on the London Riots and linking the London Riots to lots of different perspectives. So I'll link to that in the description. So London Riots for crime and deviance, you can link it to almost every perspective. Similarly, have some examples of corporate crime up your sleeve when you go into the exam if it's on crime, or the recent Casey report on the Metropolitan Police if you're doing crime and deviance. If you're doing other topics, you know, think about recent examples from the news that help explain different perspectives. So I hope that's been useful to run through the 40-mark exam technique. If you've got any feedback, any comments, or any suggestions for future content, please let me know. Thank you for listening.